Hello students. I hope that wherever this video finds you that you are safe and you're finding a way to negotiate these strange times that we're all thrown into together. I wanted to take this opportunity to record a short video lecture about Plato's Meno dialogue. I expect to follow up with a second lecture sometime in the next couple days. The reason that I've divided these into two parts is because I do think that Meno's dialogue basically confronts us with two general themes, and so I'll take up the first one in this video. The first theme is more or less the question of what is virtue. What is the definition of virtue? What is the essence of virtue? The second theme, which I will reserve for the second video, is it's slightly different. It's a question of what is knowledge and what is the process by which we acquire knowledge. So returning to the first theme, which will be the one for this video, I think this is especially interesting for us given what we've covered so far in the semester, because Meno is as a character in the dialogue, in his conversation with Socrates, he in some ways puts on display many of the, or at least two of the and again, I've always struggled for the word for this, but two of the archetypes of knowledge that we have encountered during the semester. When I mentioned them, and the first one is Plato's Parable of the Cave, and the second one is the Parable of the Blind Man and the Elephant. When I mention them, you'll know what I'm trying to say, because I've repeatedly struggled with the proper word to express what I mean. But Meno basically puts on display the way in which, in the first case, the prisoners in the bottom of the cave fail to escape the cave, and then similarly in the second case, Meno again puts on display exactly the reason that the blind men fail to understand or fail to basically cognize the elephant as such, and instead they remain with their own particular standpoints. And so those are two things that I will summarize the dialogue and try to show how those two parables give us insights into what Plato is helping us to see in this dialogue. A third way in which Meno, basically his approach, makes him distinctly unprepared to arrive at any kind of answer to the question that he poses to Socrates, is that Meno initially confronts the question. He poses the question to Socrates in the first place, and he confronts the question in a way that a collector might approach anything else, like if you were collecting hats or coins or something, and he approaches them as though they're just objects that can be acquired. He approaches knowledge as though it were just a collection of objects that can be acquired. And so he's traveled from teacher to teacher, and he basically is treating Socrates just like any other teacher. And so he comes to Socrates and he says, tell me what is virtue so that I can put it in my pocket together with all of the other definitions that I've already acquired, and then I can just be on my way. So he's treating knowledge as though it's something propositional. This is almost antithetical to Socrates' approach, as I think will be familiar by now. For Socrates, knowledge is not something propositional, and it's much more, knowledge is not information, but it's rather understanding. That already leads us into the parable of the blind man and the elephant, because again, the blind man and the elephant, each one falls into the mistake of treating, assuming that the elephant is a particular aspect of the elephant or particular content, failing to even consider that in order to understand the elephant, or in order to perceive the elephant, it has to be approached through understanding and not merely as information. And so Meno, you can immediately see Meno's attitude towards the dialogue, or towards the question of what is virtue, because he comes in and Socrates, in his usual fashion, inverts the question or poses the same question back to, rather than giving Meno an answer, he asks Meno the question himself, And Meno, you can immediately, his attitude is obvious, because the first thing he says is, there will be no difficulty in answering your question, Socrates. So Meno assumes that the question of virtue is something very straightforward. And then he goes on to list, he basically gives a litany of different virtues. And so Socrates, though not surprisingly, is unsatisfied with that answer. And in fact, Socrates gives a very telling analogy for why that's an insufficient answer. Socrates, he says, your answer is insufficient, and he says, here's why. He says, suppose now that someone asked you, Meno, the question which I asked before. Meno, such a one would say, Meno, what is shape? Suppose somebody's asking Meno, what is shape? And then suppose that Meno answered, shape is roundness. And this person would reply, he would say, I was asking you I was not asking you for a shape. I was asking you for shape as such, right? So somebody asked Meno, what is shape? And Meno gave him an instance of shape. And so round is an instance of shape. Circle is an instance of shape. What Meno failed to do was to even understand the question of what is shape as such. And so returning to virtue, Meno does something very similar, where not only does he fail to answer the question, but he really fails to ask the question or understand the question. Please keep in mind that specific failure of Meno, because, well, and it will be easy to keep in mind because it's perfectly analogous also to the mistake that the blind man and the elephant make. In other words, they fail to understand the question that's at stake when they are confronted with an elephant, right? If they knew that what they were perceiving was only one single part of something that was greater than that single part, they wouldn't fall into the mistake that they do in fact fall into, which is, in some ways, it can be described as taking a standpoint, mistaking a standpoint for understanding. Right? So the blind men in that parable, they mistake their own particular standpoints for understanding or knowledge. Meno falls into exactly the same error here. And he doesn't only do it once, but he does it over and over again. And this is it's a repeated demonstration of how, and then this is relating to the other parable, which is Plato's parable of the cave. It's a repeated demonstration of how a condition to learn anything new is that a person does not assume that he or she already knows the answer. Right? We can only learn what we don't think we already know. And so this dialogue is over and over again a demonstration of how crucial that is. In other dialogues, at least 3 other dialogues, Socrates more or less says something along the lines of that wonder is the beginning of all philosophy. All philosophy begins with wonder. And this is one way to understand what he means when he says something like that. Well, with that, I will conclude this short lecture. Socrates does ultimately offer some kind of answer to the question, but not surprisingly, it's lost on Meno, because Meno assumes that he already knows the answer to the question. But before I give Socrates' brief definition, I just want to return to the notion of assuming that somebody already knows the answer to a question. In our second lecture about Meno, which I will record sometime in the next several days, we will see almost the antithesis of Meno's approach, because we will see how Meno's own servant is able to, quite in a contrast with his master, with Meno. Meno's own servant is actually able to learn something which his master is not. And so, but that will be mostly a topic for the second dialogue. I misspoke, for the second lecture. So on that note, I will mention Socrates' Socrates is, it's not exactly a definition of knowledge, or a definition of virtue, but Socrates, he identifies a necessary condition of virtue, which is not exactly the same as a definition, but it's something that without this condition, that something can't be virtuous. And Socrates' idea is that in order for something to be virtuous, it has to be done with knowledge or with sense or with consciousness. And so he gives the example of a courageous person, and he says, if somebody just happens to perform a courageous act, in some ways that's just an accident. Like it might have well have just been, it might have well have been something brash, right? Like he might have actually caused damage. And so it's just by sheer luck that it happened to be courageous. So Socrates says that a condition of virtue is that it be done in knowledge with consciousness, and that's a continual theme in Socratic Plato's dialogues about Socrates. Socrates is most famous for saying that the unexamined life is not worth living, and so over and over again Socrates is trying to emphasize that actually knowledge itself confers value to our lives, and so that's something we can again pick up on in the second lecture. So on that note, I will wish everybody the best, and I will conclude this brief video lecture. So farewell.